August 14th, 1973, 9:42 p.m. A back room above a seafood restaurant on 125th Street, Harlem. 6 men sat around a rectangular table, one overhead light, no windows, 2 ashtrays already full. A ledger lay open near the center, its pages weighted down by a folded menu. 3 glasses had condensation rings beneath them. 1 chair remained empty. Frank Lucas entered last. The door closed behind him. It did not lock. It didn't need to. This is a dramatized narrative inspired by historical eras and public figures. It is not a verified historical account. Frank took the empty chair at the head of the table. He did not remove his coat. He placed his hat on the table, upside down, directly over the ledger's spine. The pages beneath it stopped moving. Nobody spoke. To Frank's right sat Nicky Barnes, hands folded, eyes alert. To his left, Benny Roberts, counting something silently with his thumb against his index finger. Across from Frank sat Calvin Shortstack Green, sweating through his collar despite the room's fan spinning overhead. Next to him, a man named Leon, quiet, jaw tight, eyes fixed on the ledger he was not allowed to touch. Behind Leon, standing against the wall near the door, was Eddie Razor. He didn't sit, he never did. Eddie held a straight razor loosely in his right hand, not open, not closed, just resting there like it belonged. Frank looked at the ledger, then at the glasses, then at Leon. "How many shipments last week?" Frank asked. Leon cleared his throat. 4. Frank nodded once. "And how many cleared?" 4, Leon said again, faster this time. Frank did not respond. The fan continued turning. The overhead light hummed faintly. Somewhere below them, a plate shattered in the kitchen. Nobody reacted. Frank reached forward and slid one of the glasses an inch to the right. It stopped just short of the ledger. "Read me the numbers," Frank said. Leon hesitated. Not long, just enough. Benny Roberts stopped counting with his fingers. Leon opened the ledger. His hands shook as he flattened the page. First shipment, 72 keys, moved clean. Frank waited. Second shipment, same. Frank waited. Third shipment, Leon paused, licked his lips. Third shipment came in light. How light? 2 missing. Nobody moved. Eddie Razor shifted his weight. The razor stayed loose in his hand, but his thumb slid slightly along the handle, still closed. Frank leaned back in his chair. "Say that again," he said. Leon swallowed. 2 keys didn't make it. Frank nodded back, too quickly. "Yes." Frank looked at the ledger again. He did not touch it. "Who signed off on the count?" he asked. Leon didn't answer immediately. Frank turned his head slightly, not toward Nicky, not toward Benny, just enough to let the silence stretch. "Nicky?" Frank said. "Yes," Nicky replied. "How long has Leon been handling intake alone?"
Nicky answered without hesitation. 3 weeks. Frank nodded. "And in those 3 weeks, we're short 2 keys." Leon's chair creaked as he shifted forward. "Frank, I can explain." Frank raised one finger. Leon stopped. Frank looked at Eddie Razor for the first time. Not a stare, not a signal, just a look. Eddie took 1 step forward. The sound of leather shoes on wood was louder than it should have been. Leon noticed. "So where did they go?" Frank asked calmly. Leon's mouth opened, closed. "They didn't disappear," Frank continued. "They moved. Everything moves." Leon glanced at Benny, then at Nicky. Neither reacted. "I was going to tell you," Leon said. "I just needed time to fix it." Frank leaned forward now. His elbows rested on the table, his hands clasped together once, then separated. "You don't fix missing product," Frank said. "You explain it." Leon nodded. There was pressure. Frank waited. "From who?" Frank asked. Leon exhaled sharply. "Someone from Jersey." Eddie Razor opened the razor. Not fully, just enough for the metal to catch the light. Leon's eyes dropped to it. Frank did not look away from Leon. "Name," Frank said. Leon shook his head. "I can't." Frank lifted his hand again. Same finger, same motion. Leon stopped mid-word. Frank spoke without raising his voice. "Eddie." That was all. Eddie stepped closer to Leon's chair. The razor stayed low, not at the throat, not yet, just close enough to be noticed. Leon's sentence never finished. The room waited. Nobody spoke after Frank said Eddie's name. The fan kept turning. The ledger stayed open beneath the hat. The razor reflected the overhead bulb in a thin, clean line that moved slightly as Eddie adjusted his grip. Still no contact. Still no blood. Leon stared at the table. Not at Frank. Not at Eddie. At the table. Frank leaned back again, slow, measured. He picked up one of the glasses and rolled it gently between his palms. The ice inside clinked once, then settled. "You said Jersey," Frank said. "That's a place, not a person." Leon's throat moved as he swallowed. He didn't give a name. Frank nodded, as if that answer fit somewhere. "How did he reach you?" Frank asked. Leon hesitated, just long enough. "Phone. Payphone near the station." Frank turned the glass upside down on the table. Water spilled slightly, creeping toward the ledger before stopping at the edge of the menu. "How many calls?" "2." Frank didn't react. "Times?" he asked. Leon glanced up briefly. "Late, after midnight." Frank nodded. He turned his head slightly toward Nikki. "Nikki?" "Yes," Nikki said. "When we move product, how many people know the numbers before it lands?" Nikki answered immediately. 4. Frank lifted one finger. "Names." Nikki didn't hesitate. "You, me, Benny, Leon." Frank looked back at Leon. "That's a short list. Real short." Leon shook his head quickly. "I didn't sell it. I was going to replace it. I swear." Frank didn't acknowledge the word swear. He leaned forward and picked up his hat. The ledger pages beneath it lifted slightly, then settled again when he placed the hat back down. This time, sideways. The spine was exposed now. "Open it," Frank said. Leon reached for the ledger. His hand paused when Eddie shifted closer. The razor was still low, but now it was open fully. Clean, sharp, waiting. Leon opened the ledger. Frank pointed with 2 fingers. "Read that line." Leon followed his finger. "Shipment 3, intake verified, count signed." "By who?" Frank asked. Leon's voice dropped. "Me." Frank nodded once. "Read the margin," Frank said. Leon swallowed. "Adjusted after arrival." Frank didn't move. "Adjusted how?" Frank asked. Leon closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "By 2." The room stayed still. Frank stood up. Not suddenly, not forcefully. He simply stood. Everyone else remained seated. Even Eddie didn't move, just turned slightly so he was square with Leon's chair. Frank walked around the table slowly. His shoes made no sound on the wood. He stopped behind Leon. Not close, not touching, just behind. Frank rested one hand on the back of Leon's chair. "You adjusted the numbers," Frank said, "before you told me." Leon nodded. "I needed time." Frank leaned down slightly. His mouth was near Leon's ear now. His voice stayed even. "Time for what?" Frank asked. Leon shook his head. "To fix it." Frank straightened. "You don't fix numbers," Frank said. "You freeze them." He walked back to his chair, sat, folded his hands on the table. "Who else knew?" Frank asked. Leon's eyes flicked toward Eddie, then back to the ledger. "Nobody." Frank nodded. "Benny," Frank said. "Yes." "When was the last time Leon handled intake alone before 3 weeks ago?" Benny thought for a moment. "Never." Frank nodded. He turned to Leon. "So 3 weeks, 2 missing, 1 adjustment." Leon opened his mouth. Frank raised his hand again. Leon stopped. Frank looked at Eddie Razor. Eddie's eyes never left Leon. "Eddie," Frank said quietly. Eddie took another step forward. The razor rose slightly, not to the throat, to the jawline, enough to make its presence unavoidable. Leon's breathing quickened. "I can get them back. I know where they went." Frank didn't respond. "I can bring them tonight, I swear." Frank looked down at the ledger. He tapped the open page once with his fingertip. "That page doesn't move. You do." Leon's hands clenched into fists on his knees. Frank leaned back. "How long," Frank asked, "before the next shipment lands?" Nicky answered, 36 hours. Frank nodded. "If I let this continue, what happens to the flow?" Nobody answered. Frank looked at each man at the table, one by one. No rush. The flow doesn't forgive pauses. It notices them.
He turned back to Leon. "You paused it," Frank said. Leon shook his head. "Just for a second." Frank's voice stayed level. "That's enough." Frank placed both palms flat on the table. "Here's what's not happening," Frank said. "We're not chasing missing product. We're not negotiating with Jersey. And we're not adjusting numbers again." He looked at Eddie. Eddie waited. Frank looked back at Leon. "You're going to tell me where they went," Frank said. "Right now." Leon swallowed hard. "And if I don't?" Leon asked. Frank didn't answer immediately. He reached forward and slid the ledger toward Eddie. Eddie placed one hand on it. Frank's eyes stayed on Leon. "You already did," Frank said. Leon frowned. "What?" Frank spoke calmly. "You told me when you hesitated. You told me when you adjusted the page. You told me when you said Jersey instead of a name." Frank paused. "The question now isn't where," he said. "It's who else." Leon's mouth opened, closed. Eddie's razor moved closer, just a fraction. Frank raised one finger. Eddie stopped. The room waited. The room didn't change when the razor appeared. That was the part most people remembered wrong later. They said the air shifted. They said voices stopped. They said something happened. Nothing happened. The man holding the razor didn't raise it. He didn't press it forward. He didn't look angry. He simply rested his elbow on the edge of the table, wrist loose, blade angled just enough to be understood, close to the other man's cheek, not touching skin. Not yet. Close enough that everyone at the table could measure the distance. Frank Lucas didn't look at the blade. He looked at the man across from him. The one who had been talking, the one who had been explaining, numbers, routes, missed deliveries, delays that didn't sound like delays anymore once you heard them twice, the one who had smiled too early when he thought the room was still his. Now that man wasn't talking. His mouth was slightly open, like he'd been interrupted mid-word. His eyes weren't on Frank. They were locked on the razor, on the clean line of steel, on the hand holding it steady without effort. Frank waited. Seconds passed, enough for someone to speak, enough for someone to object, enough for someone to ask permission. No one did. The man with the razor shifted his weight just a fraction, enough to remind everyone that his balance was comfortable, that he wasn't tense, that this wasn't improvisation. Frank finally spoke. "Finish what you were saying." The man swallowed. His throat moved visibly. He tried to smile again and failed halfway through it.
The smile collapsed into something smaller, defensive. I was saying the shipment didn't clear because the razor moved. Not fast, not dramatic, just enough to close the space by another inch. The man stopped. Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't lean forward. He didn't look impressed.
"You were saying," Frank repeated, "why my numbers don't match yours." Silence stretched. This was the part where explanations usually worked, where men filled space with detail, where they named third parties, weather, police, timing, anything that sounded external. The man tried. "There was a mistake at the dock. One crate was rerouted." Frank turned his head slightly, not toward the man speaking, toward the man holding the razor. That was all. The razor stopped moving. The man talking understood something then. Not fear, not yet. Something colder. He understood that the room wasn't listening to him anymore, that whatever he said next wasn't going to be weighed or evaluated. It was only going to be measured against time. He tried again, faster now. "I can fix it. I already started fixing it. I just need—" The razor touched skin. Not enough to cut, just enough to erase doubt. The table didn't move. No chairs scraped. No one stood up. Frank looked at the ledger lying open near his left hand. He hadn't touched it since the meeting started. The pages were flat, calm, numbers written neatly, like they expected to be believed. "Read it," Frank said. The man hesitated. Frank didn't look up. "Read the line you skipped." A hand reached for the ledger. The man's fingers shook as he traced the page. He found the line. He read it out loud. His voice cracked halfway through. The room listened. When he finished, Frank closed the ledger himself, slow, careful, as if it mattered that the pages stayed aligned. "That number," Frank said, "doesn't disappear." He finally looked at the man again. "It waits." The razor pressed in slightly, just enough to draw a thin red line. No blood yet, just promise. The man's breathing changed, shorter now, controlled but failing. "I didn't take it," he said quickly. "I didn't touch it." Frank nodded once. "I know." The man froze. Frank continued, calm as before. "If you took it, we wouldn't be here." That was when the understanding landed. Not betrayal, not violence, replacement. The man started to speak again, but the razor holder shook his head once, small, almost polite. Frank lifted a finger. The razor stopped. Frank leaned forward for the first time that night, just enough to bring his shadow across the table. "You had one job. Not loyalty, not honesty. One job." He waited. The man whispered, "Flow." Frank sat back. "Flow," he repeated, "and you interrupted it." The razor lifted away, slowly, cleanly. The red line on the man's cheek stayed where it was, thin and quiet. For a moment, it looked like that was it, like the room would exhale, like this would end with a warning instead of a cost. The man with the razor glanced at Frank, just his eyes, no movement. Frank didn't answer immediately. He looked around the table instead, at the men who had stayed silent, at the ones who hadn't looked away, at the ones who were already recalculating. Then he spoke. "Not here." The razor lowered. The man exhaled too fast. Relief came early, dangerous. Frank stood. Chairs moved back then, not rushed, controlled. The meeting dissolved without anyone saying it was over. As Frank walked toward the door, he paused. He didn't turn around. "Clean the table," he said. No name, no instruction beyond that. Behind him, the razor came up again. Frank didn't stop walking. The door opened, closed. The sound that followed wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. By the time anyone thought to look at the table again, the room already understood what the interruption had cost, and the flow moved on without him.